For half a century, Iran built its entire approach to controlling the Strait of Hormuz around three small rocky islands that most people have never heard of. Greater Tunb, Lesser Tunb, and Abu Musa sit right at the strait's mouth, the narrowest, most valuable stretch of ocean on the planet. Combined, they cover less ground than a mid-sized American town, but their location made them worth far more than territory, many times their size. Iranian officials had a phrase for them: stationary unsinkable aircraft carriers. Researchers at a Chinese university studying the region called the Broader Island Network Iran's arch defense, a chain built to make the Strait of Hormuz impossible for any outside power to control without Tehran's approval. Nearly every piece of Iran's naval harassment campaign in this war traces back to these islands in some way. The swarms of small boats surrounding tankers, the crews forced to abandon ship, the cruise missiles fired at vessels moving through the strait. All of it was staged, coordinated, and supported from this small chain of fortified rock. On the morning of July 15, 2026, the U.S. military arrived at one of them at 6 in the morning. What unfolded over the next 90 minutes reshaped the strategic picture of this war. And according to defense analysts tracking the wider campaign, the island strikes weren't even the most significant thing the U.S. did that week. Here's the full picture: the islands. The small boat fleet Iran has spent decades assembling the newly deployed autonomous sea drones, the A-10 Warthogs now hunting speedboats at wavetop altitude, and the single moment several defense analysts are calling a genuine turning point in how naval warfare gets fought. To understand what the U.S. actually pulled off on July 15th, you first need to understand what these islands are and why they've anchored Iran's Strait of Hormuz strategy for 50 years. When U.S. Central Command released strike statements naming Greater Tunb, Abu Musa, Keshem, and Hangam, most people had no context for what those names meant. Here's that context. The Strait of Hormuz has a narrow, tightly constrained deep-water channel. The actual navigable route oil tankers and LNG carriers use to move between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Sitting directly along that channel at the strait's western mouth are Greater Tunb, Lesser Tunb, and Abu Musa, islands Iran has physically controlled since 1971. Greater Tunb sits roughly 30 miles off the Iranian coast and about 50 miles from the UAE, positioned squarely on the inbound shipping lane tankers use heading into the Gulf. Any missile battery stationed there can cover every vessel entering or exiting the deep-water channel. Abu Musa sits farther west, watching the approach zone before ships even reach the strait itself. Lesser Tunb fills the space between them. Researchers who've studied the network closely describe these three islands as forming an integrated defensive system that lets Iran continuously monitor commercial and military shipping, and, in a crisis, threaten freedom of navigation through the strait entirely. Add in the other islands swept up in this strike campaign. Keshem is Iran's largest island in the Persian Gulf and part of that same arch defense network. Hangam was confirmed struck by Iranian state media itself. And Bandar Abbas, the major port city and naval base on the Iranian mainland, sits directly overlooking the strait. Together, these locations aren't peripheral targets. They form the central nervous system of the Revolutionary Guard's maritime warfare capability in this theater. And over roughly a week, the U.S. military systematically dismantled major pieces of it. There's a historical wrinkle here that explains why the UAE has been watching these strikes so closely. These three islands weren't always Iranian. On November 30th, 1971, 2 days before the formal founding of the United Arab Emirates, the Iranian Imperial Navy, acting under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, seized all three islands by force. The takeover was swift and violent. At Lesser Tunb, 6 local police officers tried to hold off roughly 2,000 Iranian soldiers. 4 people were killed. The islands fell within hours. 2 days later, the UAE was born, and one of its first acts as a nation was to formally protest the loss of territory it considered its own, now permanently occupied by a far larger neighbor. For more than 50 years, the UAE has kept that sovereignty claim alive. Raised at Gulf Cooperation Council summits, Arab League meetings, and joint statements with European partners, Iran has rejected every one of those claims. And while diplomats argued for decades, Iran built. By the mid-1990s, researchers had documented Iranian Revolutionary Guard troops stationed on Abu Musa alongside American-made Hawk anti-aircraft batteries, artillery, and Chinese-built Silkworm anti-ship missiles. By early last year, Iran's naval commander for the Revolutionary Guard, later killed by Israeli forces during this conflict, publicly stated that missile systems on the three islands could reach targets up to 600 kilometers away, covering essentially the entire Persian Gulf from islands his country had seized half a century earlier. He called them his most important operational area. On July 15, 2026, the United States set out to prove that claim wrong. Here's the part of this story that gets the least attention, and it's arguably the most important piece for understanding why the U.S. response has taken this shape. Autonomous sea drones, A-10s flying at wave-top altitude over the Gulf, all of it. Because the most dangerous weapon in Iran's naval arsenal isn't the island missile batteries, it isn't the submarines, it's what's known as the Mosquito Fleet. Congress's own nonpartisan research arm has documented this fleet as consisting of thousands of small, high-speed boats capable of hitting 40 to 60 knots, armed with machine guns, rockets, and in some cases, anti-ship missiles. These boats don't need a port. They don't need to be tracked by conventional radar the way a warship does. They swarm, they scatter, and they're nearly impossible to eliminate with a single strike the way a fixed missile site can be. That's exactly why they've driven so much of Iran's harassment campaign against commercial shipping throughout this war, forcing tanker crews to abandon ship, swarming vessels moving through the strait, creating precisely the kind of chaos that spikes insurance premiums and scares commercial operators away from the region without a single missile ever firing. Taking out the islands doesn't eliminate the Mosquito Fleet directly. What it does is blind it. Those boats depend on the surveillance systems, radar coverage, and command infrastructure based on the islands to locate targets in the first place. Sever that connection, and you don't need to sink every boat. You just need to make sure they can't see well enough to find anything worth attacking. On the morning of July 15th, the U.S. military hit Greater Tum's coastal defense systems and cruise missile launch sites in a dedicated 90-minute strike package, the campaign's first daylight raid on the island network. It wasn't an isolated hit. Command centers, air defense sites, surveillance systems, and missile capabilities across the wider island network in the Iranian mainland were struck within the same stretch, with reports indicating the U.S. ran 3 distinct strike waves in a single day, hitting command infrastructure, surveillance, coastal defenses, missile storage, and island launch sites simultaneously. That kind of simultaneity matters operationally. A single strike gives an adversary time to reroute, reposition, or repair. 3 coordinated waves in one day, spread across a network of interlocking islands, is designed to prevent exactly that, to degrade the whole system before any individual piece can be shored up. Analysts tracking the campaign describe it as methodical rather than improvised, a plan that appears to have been resourced and ready well before it was executed, rather than assembled on the fly in response to a single provocation. 3 days before those island strikes, something happened at Bandar Abbas that several defense analysts are calling a genuine milestone in how naval warfare is fought. 3 uncrewed Sea Corsair drones, no sailors aboard, no pilots at risk, navigated into Bandar Abbas naval base and struck a Ghador-class submarine sitting in its maintenance gantry, effectively taking it out of service. It's being described as the first autonomous maritime combat strike in American military history, an uncrewed surface vessel independently reaching a defended naval base and disabling a submarine without a single American sailor in harm's way. The significance here goes beyond the single submarine. Submarines represent Iran's deep water threat, the piece of its naval arsenal capable of operating outside the direct line of sight and reach of surface defenses. Hitting one in its own maintenance facility, using an uncrewed vessel, demonstrates a capability that changes the calculus for every other piece of infrastructure Iran considered safe simply because it wasn't the front line. If unmanned drones can penetrate a defended naval base undetected, then protected in port no longer means what it used to. With the island's surveillance and command infrastructure degraded, the next problem was the boats themselves, fast, scattered, and hard to track with conventional means. The U.S. response has been to bring in aircraft built for exactly this kind of low-altitude, close-range hunting. A-10 Warthogs and Apache gunships are now operating at wave-top altitude over the Gulf, tracking and engaging Mosquito Fleet speedboats directly, rather than relying solely on missile strikes against fixed infrastructure. Alongside that, the U.S. has reimposed a naval blockade and demonstrated it's willing to enforce it, including, in one documented case, firing a Hellfire missile into a tanker's smokestack rather than sinking the vessel outright, a move that changes the economic calculation for any shipping operator considering running cargo to Iran without actually destroying the ship or its crew. Iran, for its part, has continued using GPS spoofing in the strait, a tactic documented by CNN that throws vessel position reports off by dozens of miles, creating navigational chaos for commercial shipping even on days when no direct attack occurs. It's a reminder that degrading Iran's military hardware doesn't automatically eliminate every tool in its playbook. Some of the most disruptive tactics in this war don't require a missile at all. Put all of this together, and the picture that emerges isn't a single dramatic strike. It's a coordinated, multi-domain campaign. Airstrikes strip the islands of their forward staging platforms, missile systems, and radar coverage. Autonomous sea drones hit maintenance facilities and submarine assets at Bandar Abbas. A-10s and Apaches hunt the boats themselves at low altitude. The naval blockade, backed by a demonstrated willingness to strike tankers, changes the economic incentives for anyone still willing to run cargo through the strait. And all of it targets a distributed adaptive adversary that has spent roughly 40 years preparing specifically for this kind of fight. The islands struck on July 15th weren't just isolated military targets. They were the eyes, the launch points, and the forward command nodes the entire Mosquito Fleet doctrine depends on. Without island-based surveillance watching the strait, the Revolutionary Guard can't reliably vector its boats onto targets. Without the island missile systems, the threat envelope that has kept shipping companies away shrinks substantially. Without functioning maintenance facilities at Bandar Abbas, the submarines that represent Iran's deeper water threat can't be serviced and returned to duty. In roughly 1 week, the U.S. military struck and degraded Iran's island fortress network at the strait's mouth, including the first daylight strike on Greater Tunba, carried out the first autonomous sea drone combat strike in American history at Bandar Abbas, deployed A-10s and Apaches to hunt the Mosquito Fleet directly, reimposed and demonstrated a naval blockade, and ran 3 coordinated strike waves in a single day against command, surveillance, and missile infrastructure across the island network. The speed at which these capabilities came online suggests a readiness posture maintained throughout the earlier ceasefire, assets pre-positioned and pre-staged waiting for one trigger, Iran's renewed effort to close the strait.